Hey everyone, welcome to Climb by VSC. Each week we interview innovative founders, category experts, and the most active climate investors about their perspectives, lessons, and best practices for company building in climate tech. Today I'm thrilled to be joined by our friend Allison Wolff, co-founder and CEO of Vibrant Planet, a startup that leverages data-driven science and cloud technology to help make communities and ecosystems more resilient in the face of climate change. Allison brings to Vibrant Planet over 20 years of Silicon Valley experience across corporate strategy, product strategy, customer experience design, and marketing. I'm excited to dig in to how all of those are being used to help shape the future of climate resilience. Allison, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited for the conversation.
I'd like to kick things off where, we ended that little intro. You've had quite an interesting journey into developing technologies. Can you share a bit about your background across Netflix, Google, Facebook, and what brought you to this unique problem with Vibrant Planet?
I did start my tech career at Netflix. I had come out of the branding world, doing a lot of things for brands like Nike and Sky Vodka and creating brand experiences, and was hired to run brand and marketing at Netflix. By default, there were not very many of us, and so I ended up running user experience design and really digging into product and how people use a digital product back when we and Amazon and Google were really just getting started in the late 90s. By default, really learned that trade, did weekly user testing and that kind of stuff, and have leveraged that experience in my career ever since. After Netflix, I went into consulting, first at a firm called SY Partners, and then out on my own, really focused for about 20 years on really how to tilt some of these massive tech platforms towards good. How do we make them sort of a force for good in the world? And so that was really what I spent 20 years doing with eBay, Google, and Facebook, helping with foundational sustainability strategies, partnerships, narratives, and programs, building things like public health strategies, data for good launches. And then while at Facebook, really starting to experiment with movement building around topics like climate change and women's empowerment and various other topics, health related topics usually. Basically from there, did quite a bit of work with tech founders, one of whom was living in the Truckee Tahoe area. And really what I was helping with was impact investing strategies and some philanthropic strategies. One particular tech founder wanted to build sort of an institute in the Tahoe area that would take on something that was germane locally, but that would have global impact. And while I was doing exploratory work, mostly looking at the climate change space and what could a center take on that would be unique and added value to other centers that already existed, we had the Paradise Fire. Then we had the Carr Fire, and 2018 became the worst season anyone could have ever imagined in a state like California. So I started talking to people about what does the future look like, and started to understand the intersection of climate change and land management practices for the last 150 years, and how these two things are coming together in sort of a perfect storm way to create what we are seeing in the Western US and Europe and Australia, more and more in places like the Boreal, and started to see what the future looks like. And it is not pretty. But I also saw that there is a solution that is scalable, but that technology and science coming together was the only way that we were going to be able to solve this problem. So sort of saw the need for what we are building now and decided to rally a group of rock stars across science, forest management, and the tech sector to try to pull off what some days feels impossible.
So, before we get into that group of rock stars, because you do have a phenomenal team around you, talk us through the stakeholders in this world and who Vibrant Planet is serving. Maybe just give us an overview of what Vibrant Planet does today.
Vibrant Planet, the big gap we are filling now, really working collaboratively to develop a vision for a landscape that fundamentally changes wildfire behavior and fundamentally increases forest resilience and all the great things that come from that in terms of ecosystem services like carbon, water, biodiversity, recreation. Our lifestyle in the West is very dependent on forests and other ecotypes existing. We really developed a system to help in the planning process where we're working on plans to increase forest resilience and to decrease catastrophic wildfire. Where do we put our resources to get the what we call highest restorative return on investment? And that's very hard today, to get multiple people to agree on land management objectives, see each other's perspectives, and actually get to a plan that can take, that process is a manual workflow and can take 10 years or more. The big gap we are filling now, and we really are a platform play where we will build applications and data where needed to solve specific questions. The big question is, how do we prioritize resources? And that question is at the hyper-local level, where you've got multiple landowners and other stakeholders that are concerned about things like spotted owl habitat if you're in the Sierra Nevada, or desert tortoise if you're in Southern California or Arizona. And often plans from, groups like the Forest Service will get litigated because they can't tell if the Forest Service properly thought about watershed health or a specific species that an NGO might care about. So we really fundamentally solved for collaborative scenario planning to prioritize resources in a way that works best for the most people in a landscape. And if you think about it, we all care a lot about what happens in our backyard. People get really disturbed by prescribed fire, which is really, really needed by forests, or seeing a logging truck go down your street and you don't understand the context for why is this happening to my forest. Being able to help people see through data visualizations why decisions are being made, what kind of work is happening, and why it's needed is super critical. So the platform fundamentally solves for that at the local level, but it also helps even national level. Where should the infrastructure funding, where should the Inflation Reduction Act funding get deployed at a national scale? Where can the federal government get the most bang for its buck to eliminate risk to communities and to increase forest resilience in all the ways the Forest Service is trying to manage for, including recreation, biodiversity, water, carbon? So that multi-benefit problem is very hard to plan for and to get multiple stakeholders on board with. So that's really what we solve for today. The system is also, because we have current conditions data, which is really for the first time, we can help with the monitoring and reporting back to whether it's the local community. Were the decisions we made effective? How is wildfire resilience trending? How are our forests doing in the face of climate change? So being able to actually track and report on that, if you can believe it, does not happen today. And same thing, up to Congress. So the USDA Forest Service has to report back to Congress. Was the spend for the Inflation Reduction Act effective? Are we kind of winning in this issue on, climate friendly forest management and on changing wildfire behavior, so less damage is done to ecosystem services and communities?
Really, really appreciate that context, especially the part about actually reporting to the local communities, because I feel like they're the ones that maybe get least talked about in this. The government and politicians obviously are allocating dollars towards this and expect some return, but the local communities are the ones that get overlooked. Speaking about pulling together all these different constituencies, we have seen so many enterprises that have enacted net zero goals, targets for getting net zero by 2050. And it requires having buy-in from constituencies, government agencies that they necessarily have not worked with. What have you learned about working with these government agencies, with local conservancies, as I think they're going to start to become bigger players as we have, enterprise level climate change conversations? What have you learned by working with them?
When you think about an agency like the Forest Service or Department of Interior, where BLM and federal parks sit, that is most of the land ownership in the Western U.S. It's a little different in the East Coast, where you have more private land ownership. But in the West, public agencies are the majority landowner and land manager. And so, one of the big learnings is just ways that we can support them that are in the wood grain, pun intended, of how they work today, and embracing the bureaucracy that is needed to protect lands. It's really just a matter of using technology to increase transparency, to improve communication. The Forest Service has to engage adjacent landowners and then other stakeholders, like I mentioned, NGOs that have special interest and for good reason have reasons to make sure that the public agencies are doing right by specific species that they care about, or watershed health, or those kinds of issues. Yeah, a lot of it is really learning how agencies like the Forest Service work today, meeting them where they are, and making sure we're not disruptive in what we're creating, but we're really helping to augment or facilitate what they're trying to do anyway, but with more science, more information, and easier to use workflows and communication tools.
The challenge I think I often see with and you've been in the Silicon Valley world for many years, the move fast and break things approach kind of hits a brick wall when you start dealing with government. What do you think are some of the mistakes or biggest challenges that startups such as yourself face when they are working to serve these government constituencies?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue is trust. So there have been private companies in the past who have been accused of profiting off of publicly funded data, or who are opaque and not transparent about how are they using publicly funded data to help in emergency services, for example, or carbon markets. So the more open and transparent companies can be, especially when dealing with public agencies, the more trust can be built and true partnership. I think there's a lot of interest in public-private partnerships, but trust is sort of the first barrier to make sure, are your intentions good? What is your mission as a private company? Are you trying to just get rich on our data and our problem? There's a lot of sensitivity there that I think we private companies have to be really aware of. Part of our strategy has been to actually set up Vibrant Planet as a public benefit corp, so that it has at its core, a mission and triple bottom line kind of actions and reporting and governance. We also are a hybrid structure. We have a nonprofit arm where, as we build out really valuable data sets for the scientific and agency community, we are giving away that data as part of our public benefit corp impact to the scientific community, so that the whole space can evolve using new state-of-the-art data on forest structure and things like that. So we have been especially thoughtful and working very hard to make mission and impact and sort of gifting to the public sector for public good a big part of what we're doing.
I think that the topic of trust is becoming more and more important, especially as we look at carbon credit markets, which have really come into front page review, and not in a good way when it comes to the practices, when it comes to the attribution. What do you think is missing? Where is that credibility gap when it comes to carbon credit markets? And how is Vibrant Planet hoping to solve that?
Yeah, tricky question. And we are just starting to enter the carbon market. So just to quickly give a bit of context on how we're coming into it. Our system around prioritization, monitoring, and reporting for land management purposes, to answer that question of where can we get the most bang for our buck with always limited resources, even though there's billions flowing into land management from the federal government in the US, it's still not enough. And so we have to figure out, where do we put resources in what order? We also have to unlock private capital to come in with public capital to make sure that we can restore forests in the US at the scale that is required. I mean, Blue Forest Conservation, one of our partners on a project, estimates that California needs $58 billion over the next decade in order to turn the tides on its forests, where we are at huge risk in California of not having much forest left in the next 15 years if we don't increase the pace and scale of restoration. And California will get several billion, but not 58 billion over the next 10 years. So really one of the keys is unlocking these private markets to pay for $2,000 to $3,000 an acre work, where we're doing mechanical thinning, applying prescribed fire, to get fire back in these fire adapted ecosystems. It desperately needs it. It's starved for good fire. We have to remove fuels to avoid catastrophic fire. So we at Vibrant Planet are really focused on the carbon market, but as it relates to getting that restoration work funded. So it's very purposeful. We aren't just in it for the carbon offset. Yeah. We're trying to create a pathway for restorative work to happen. And that happens not just once. You don't restore a forest once. You have to tend it over time. And because forests grow back. So for us, our approach is really starting with this fundamental issue of, and this question of how do we move forests to resilience so that they don't burn down, they don't die of drought-driven disease, and we move them back to sort of a natural forest structure that was there before European Americans arrived, and fire was rolling through on a regular basis. We've suppressed fire for 130 years, and we also deforested North America before that, and so the forest structure is really unresilient. So our work is to get back a natural forest structure in many ways that will also be resilient into the future to things like wildfire, flooding, and drought. We can, in our system and planning, we can quantify the value of that resilient forest. So in the planning software, we quantify what is the carbon, water, biodiversity, and recreational value of moving that forest to resilience. And then we can unlock the downstream markets. So I guess the difference between us and others is rather than coming at it from the carbon market side and we see trees that are super valuable and we want to monetize those, we're really tying it directly to actions that have to happen on the ground and financing those actions. One of the big questions is additionality. So wherever we can prove, and this is where remote sense data can really help with the transparency and proof that something is additional, tying, especially in fire adapted forests, the carbon finance world to real actions that you can see from satellites and other remote sensing technologies like LiDAR, tying those two things together is paramount. So, and very different than providing a new source of revenue in a commercial tree farm context, for example, for landowners. Really different kind of action happening on the ground for that carbon finance.
Staying on this topic for a minute, given how many enterprises are using these credits to achieve, in heavy air quotes for the audio medium, their net zero goals, are you seeing the winds change from a like a regulatory standpoint, or like even a ratings agency equivalent, the way we have in the financial markets, for there to be a mutually agreed upon arbiter of the quality of these carbon credits? Because right now it really does feel like the Wild West.
Yeah, it very much is. And, there are emerging players like a Silvera that is starting to step in to play that role. Mostly the carbon market has been focused on either the commercial tree farm space and basically incentivizing landowners to keep trees for a longer period of time and paying them for the carbon benefit. Or in the tropics, where we're trying to avoid deforestation in a place like the Amazon, literally paying farmers mostly to not cut forests, to keep, one of the rules of in the Amazon is to pay a farmer to keep 80% of their land forested and only farm 20% of it, to stop the cutting and then burning that basically is sort of the nail on the coffin in a tropical context. Basically, in the Amazon, we just need to leave the forest alone, and it pulls down carbon. So it's incentivizing the right protective actions. The gray zone that we're trying to fill is in these fire-prone forests that we are losing very, very quickly to fire, and where we have to unlock private capital to come in alongside public capital to pay for this $2,000 to $3,000 an acre work that I mentioned. That does work, right? Like fire-prone forests were adapted to fire. They need it to cycle carbon, to cycle nutrients, even for the pine cone seeds to pop in a place like the Sierra Nevada. They need a Goldilocks fire temperature for that to actually happen. If it's too hot, it sterilizes the seed. If there is no fire, which is what has happened with 100% fire suppression policy, then the regeneration doesn't happen at all. So we have to get fire back on these landscapes. And right now they're so hazardously overgrown from fire suppression. And like I said, clear cuts before that, in a lot of places, it's not safe to actually bring fire back on the land. So that's where it's a complicated story that we are taking on, but we have to link the carbon market to ultimately getting fire back on fire adapted landscapes. And again, that is most forests in the world.
When we talk about storytelling and narrative building, that's where you have spent a lot of your career. It's obviously what VSC does with our clients and our portfolio companies. How do you take a idea that is counterintuitive like this? I think there's quite a few counterintuitive things when we talk about climate innovation. Things have just been done for so long to try to convince people that fire is good. Fire is, 100% suppression policy is not actually positive. What are the tactics that you use to convince people that this is the right path forward?
It is. It's a really wild narrative challenge, the hardest I've ever had in my career. On fire alone, we're at a point a little bit like climate change where we can choose which kind of fire do you want? Do you want controlled burns and low intensity wildland fire because we've removed fuels and the forest is healthy? Or do you want catastrophic fire that burns through your town and on the way it burns up valuable carbon sinks and destroys water sources and biodiversity and the trails that we like to ride our bikes on? So it is that simple. We get to pick, and if we work fast enough, we can have low intensity wildland and prescribed fire. If we don't move fast enough, we're going to have catastrophic fire and we're going to lose everything in the West. I mean, it's really quite scary what the next few decades look like out here. So that's one twist, right? And one of the key ways we can fight catastrophic fire is with good fire. And getting people's heads around loving fire when we hate smoke. We hate, it's not pleasant, but we have to get our heads around the fact that the fire was here first and we have to live with it. We have to learn to love it. So the other twist is there's a lot of narrative around, anti-deforestation. In the last few years, in most places in the West, people really do understand the need to pull some trees out to actually get that natural forest structure back. We have in many places, like in the Sierra, we have about double the number of trees that the forest would naturally have if we hadn't deforested and if we hadn't suppressed fire all these years. So it's hard to get your head around that when you go to a place like Lake Tahoe, and that to imagine half the trees that we have. And you think that might look ugly, but it would be really beautiful if we could get to that result. And the forest will make it through climate change. The science shows us if we can remove some of the fuels. So it's very hard when we're dealing with what's happening in the Amazon, where we absolutely do not want to cut any trees. We need to leave the Amazon intact, leave it alone. It's a completely different ecotype, but we have to cut trees in much of the temperate forests across North America, certainly, and in many places in Europe and Australia. It's very hard when you have a deforestation narrative in tropical forests to help people understand we have to remove trees in order to save forests. And people fight it, right? Understandably. So yeah, there's a bunch of odd twists in this story from a communication perspective.
Yeah, I do think that what is really interesting and gives me a lot of optimism is how many people from general tech, from some of the companies that you started your career at or worked with over your career, are now flocking to climate innovation companies. Mm-hmm. So talk to me a little bit about how you've built your team and what are things that CEOs that are building in climate innovation can do to entice top talent to come and work with them on these important challenges.
Yeah, it's been very interesting building this team the last few years on both sides, actually, but from folks that came out of the science world and forestry world as well. So on the tech side, I feel this snowballing happening of people really wanting to work on something meaningful, and people are feeling the effects of climate change. Fire is one of the things that's in our face in the West, so you can't avoid it. And I think people are at a point in their careers. climate change and all kinds of things are contributing to people wanting to, if they're going to spend 40 to 60 hours a week working on something, making sure it matters. So from that perspective, it's been, I don't want to say easy, but the flow of people into our company, we've been able to get a lot of the talent that we sought. On the other side, from the Forest Service carbon market side, I think a lot of people have spent time in government working on these problems, and they're frustrated by how slow things move and really see the need to work inside the private sector, especially from a technology perspective, to get more done faster and have more impact with things that can, help with these communication problems and, through data visualization and some of the things that we're building. So it's been really interesting. People are coming into Vibrant Planet, and I imagine other climate tech companies from these different sectors for different reasons, but all in the name of trying to make a big difference on the things that we're facing as a society.
As you build a company that has these two sides of the world, right? Folks coming in from the tech world, folks coming in from land management and agencies and conservancies, how do you manage the culture clash? Maybe too strong of a word, but the different vibes of these people and where they come from. How do you make sure that you're building a culture where sort of both sides are held, climate and tech work side by side?
It's been really interesting to watch the teams come to just things like shared language, even acronyms that we use for things that we're building together. And it has not come without struggle. There are expectations on speed and how things are communicated, and scientists tending towards perfection, and, Silicon Valley tech, like getting stuff out there that's good enough and then iterating. The workflows internally have not come without conflict. What's been really interesting is over the last 6 months, especially, because we've really been at this as a broader team of now 33 people for the last 6 months. And so now that we've really got the cadence of work and the workflows established, the team is humming along and have worked through some of the conflicts. And now it is truly magic to watch what they are building together across science and tech. It's hard to describe, but even just watching our Slack channel with our engineers and scientists working through problems, it is literally magical to watch.
Are there other challenges or other differences that you have seen coming from having worked in regular tech to now working in climate tech that you're finding that maybe you didn't realize before you got into working in climate innovation?
For us, I think anyone in the nature-based climate solutions space, the timelines of working with government are difficult, and regulations, and the reasons for some of the bureaucracy are well-founded, right? Like the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA, there is a 2-year process once a plan is created for land management in the US. You have to go through a 2-year process of cultural surveys for ancient cultural sites and species surveying. Where are the most recent spotted owl habitat in the Pacific Northwest? Those environmental regs were created because we needed them. We were cutting too much forest. We played out the Lorax, and it had to be stopped. And so there's this kind of tension between embracing bureaucracy that exists and also trying to not bust through it, because we don't want to rid ourselves of things like NEPA, but using things like technology to move the processes faster and even make them better with more information, better science being applied to environmental regulation and permitting processes. So I think there's a ton of opportunity to bring technology, policy, land management together. And I think that's true throughout the nature-based climate solutions space. And then just figuring out how to engage with government. We all have to, whether you're working in Brazil or working in Colorado, you have to engage government. And I think the tech sector, the trust topic that we brought up earlier, making sure that we really are in line with sort of a mutual end goal and not just making shareholders happy and that kind of thing. We really do need to be thoughtful about how we're approaching these problems, especially when government is involved.
Yeah. So as you've been building Vibrant Planet, you recently announced a $17 million capital raise that you did. There's obviously a lot of investor interest in climate innovation, a lot of VCs that are actively putting their hand up and saying we want to build climate-only funds. As you went through your process of raising capital for Vibrant Planet, what are the things that you look for in an investor, and what was your hierarchy of what was important to you when you chose VCs for your business?
The most important thing for us is, as you can tell from our story today, we are dealing with a very complex topic. It is not a quick get. It is not an easy business. So what we've tried to look for is funders that understand that if we're successful, we will have a very big, sticky business that is solving a fundamental problem that unlocks lots of downstream markets that we can participate in to get the shareholder returns that are expected by venture funders, but aren't necessarily done on the back of government, back to the trust issue. So for us, we've just looked for funders who have a pretty good understanding of the problem. We've found that those that want a simple story, that our business is too complicated for them. But where we have found investors like Ecosystem Integrity Fund, who led our last round, and Grantham Foundation, who led the previous round, they fundamentally get what is needed. And so we work to try to find the folks that really understand the problems on the ground, and what kind of change we're trying to instigate, and get the business model that's attached to the kind of theory of change.
Yeah, one of the things that we do on the show is speak to other VC investors, and I often ask them the question, given how long some of these climate solutions really take to get off the ground and to make meaningful change, is a 10-year life for a fund enough? Do we need to have longer fund cycles to really gestate some of these companies at the level that they need to be invested in? Most funds, I think, have not done that. They've sort of stuck to that 10-year model. But I'm curious, from your perspective, when raising capital, where does patience and sort of investors that understand these long sales cycles, where does that fit into your consideration of choosing an investor?
It's such a true statement. And we aren't sure yet how fast we become what would be a typically venturable business. And so we look for investors that understand the mission, want to ultimately have the impact that we're trying to have, and also understand that if we are successful, this becomes a very big, sticky business with a lot of downstream market opportunity. So we really look for investors that are definitely looking at the climate change space, understand, our best investors have some understanding of how land management works today, which is just a very complex problem, like we talked about in this conversation, and really understand that if we succeed in solving the land management problem fundamentally, which may be a lower margin SaaS business than they're used to, but if we get wide engagement, what that unlocks in the future, and having the patience to allow us to get there, and supporting us to get there. So those are the kinds of investors we've really looked for, and luckily we've found them. I mean, there are increasing numbers of investors that truly get what we are working on.
I guess where we'll start to close out, the current economic slowdown, if that's what we can call it, the future economic environment is on everybody's mind.
Yep.
Where do you think that has an impact on climate tech, or maybe does it have an impact on climate tech?
Yeah, it's been interesting to go through this wobbly market. We had a brief hesitation soon after our last round. Luckily, we had our round closed in May, and then the market really crashed in June. And just talking to current and investors sort of surrounding us, I did feel a bit of a, let's step back and everybody take a breath here. But it does feel, to me at least, and some of the investors that I talked to about this question, that climate tech in particular, and especially nature-based solutions, has sort of bounced back and people are moving full steam ahead. And I think it's because the urgency is so great. I think a lot of people are driven by a bigger purpose on this stuff, and, trying to look their kids in the eye and say they tried to use the powers they had to do something. So I really think that the bigger mission on climate tech and nature-based solutions specifically is, and issues like wildfire hitting us in the face. I think the urgency is so great that it's helping things along. The other thing is, with government funding flowing at the at the level it is flowing, with $50 billion in the infrastructure bill earmarked for the wildland resilience problem, and another $25 billion earmarked from the Inflation Reduction Act for specifically what we at Vibrant Planet are doing. That has helped us a lot. So, I think investors are seeing that we're making headway on government engagement and how much we can help, from an impact perspective, and that's going to be a viable business. And get us to the downstream markets faster, because the more folks using our software, the more we can really understand how lands are trending towards resilience, and what the benefit of that is, which is the key for the downstream market. So our theory of change is starting to play out, I guess, is the point.
Well, you kind of led me into my final question, where I'd like to close with a lot of our guests. I think obviously on Climb, we want to inject our conversations with a sense of urgency. But what I feel is often missing is that sense of optimism. So, Allison, what is something, whether it's around what Vibrant Planet is doing or your just belief in climate innovation generally, what is something that gives you a lot of optimism about climate tech and climate innovation today?
The space that we're specifically in, the nature-based space, we obviously have to have a gunshot approach on everything. We need continued innovation on moving away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. The Inflation Reduction Act is giving one more great big shove to that final transition, which is I'm so thrilled about. And then with nature-based solutions, trees are the best technology we have, and soil and ag lands, to pull the carbon that sits in the atmosphere down. As we emit carbon, it's up there for 100 years. And we have to pull some of it down, or we will not meet some of the temperature targets from the Paris Accord. Nature-based climate solutions are ready now. We know what to do. We know how to manage land in a sustainable, regenerative way. We know how to get forests back to a state where they are net carbon sinks. Many of them are flipping to net carbon emitters, and that is solely our fault because of land management. So I think in our space, what drives me every day is we know what to do. The solution is powerful. It can happen right now if we move fast enough, and we can improve life on Earth if we keep these systems intact. And technology is mature enough that it can actually be applied to the problem in a meaningful way to make sure we can increase the pace and scale of these restorative and protective solutions. So I just encourage more and more people to jump into the space, and I feel like we just need to get this done.
I love that. And that is the exact kind of energy that we love to leave the show on. Allison, you've been so gracious with your time today. I think the two biggest takeaways for me is that, one, a lot of the work that climate innovation and climate tech companies are doing will seem counterintuitive. And so the more that you lean into it, and the more that you're able to build a narrative and story around it, the more you're able to actually enact the changes that need to be done, right? And you positioned it correctly. You can either have controlled fire or you can have catastrophic fire. You're going to have one of those two. So pick the one that is actually beneficial. Right. And the second lesson, I think, was too many companies for too long, especially in general tech, have run away from government and run away from government agencies and the involvement of government because it just slows things down. And I think there's a collective realization that some of us have had and some of us are having that that can't happen. This change at the level that it has to happen can't happen without government involvement. So we're really grateful that companies such as Vibrant Planet are here and leading the way and making that change. I want to thank you so much for joining us on Climb. Where can folks find out more about Vibrant Planet and the amazing work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, you can go to vibrantplanet.net, and there's a contact form there. We actually answer it every day. So please get in touch if you're interested in what we're up to, and we will reach back out.
Thank you so much for joining me on Climb by VSC.
Yeah, great conversation. Thanks, Jay.